Jason Smith. I'm so excited to see you. How are you doing?
Hello, Kami Paulson. Great to be with you.
I know you too. I was just thinking of all the places and all the times we've worked together, and I was trying to figure out how long we've actually known each other, and I think it's like 15 years. Is that right?
I think so. It's starting to sound like a Dr. Seuss. Oh, the places we'll go, or places we've been.
Right.
I think it was when you were at Selectica
Hmm.
and I was at Huron,
That's right.
and that would have been before 2011.
Oh
So
my gosh, it's been a long time.
yeah,
And we've worked together. We've run across each other in various companies across our time in CLM.
yep, yep. This world is small enough as it
I
is that
know. It's good to keep your nose
yeah,
clean. That's what I always say, because you're going to run across those people multiple times in your career in
yep,
CLM.
yep. And they will, and some people will pop up when you least
Least
expect it to.
expected.
So yeah,
I know.
it's
So
good to be
I
here.
know. So tell me, I mean, I know about your background from working with you for so long, but tell me a little bit about just your background, and then how you got
Yeah.
into CLM.
It's that long and winding road. I woke up when I was 5 years old. I wanted to do contract management, and
Right.
I went to law school to become a sports agent, as if you couldn't tell from the
Uh-huh.
background here.
Yep.
And while I was there, I stumbled into technology and started seeing there was a company that was building big access databases for mass tort litigation, and I got involved in that. And I thought, man, this is really cool. And I wasn't like the top 1% of law school
Hmm.
grades, right? So finding an alternative avenue was key for me. And when I found this, I thought, oh, this is a great way to make my mark as something different than just your basic run of the mill lawyer. And the more I got into it, the more I realized, look, everything in legal is so rules driven
Yeah.
that it's perfect for technology, for automation and some of these things. Now, this was back in the 90s. So the stuff we have today, was still fantasy stuff. And so just doing some of the basic automation, taking, the law firm's files and Redwells and putting them into an electronic database
Yeah.
where you could search them and report was like cutting edge.
Yeah.
And had a couple of attorneys come to me and say, "Hey, we'd like to build this company," and it was the back of the napkin thing at a Chinese restaurant here in Houston, and I built the prototype for what became Power Brief, which is now CSC's matter management
Yep.
and service process tool. And we had some success with that, and I helped build another piece of it that was their video deposition editing tool that was on the web. But this was on the web when people were still at barely 56K modems.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the infrastructure wasn't there to really support the innovation that we were trying to do. And again, if I went back and told myself back then, like there might be things that I would do a little bit differently ahead of time, but I had no idea what I was doing
Hmm.
at the time. I was just feeling my way through a dark room. And it just so happened that the team that had built our business plan uh, had come from Anderson.
Hmm.
They were the ones that then created Huron. And so kind of circle back around and ended up meeting some folks in about 2004, 2005 at Huron. They told me, hey, we've got this business where we're consulting with law firms and corporate legal departments, and it would be great to have a lawyer who has some technology background on the team, and like the rest was history. So I started doing matter management, e-billing, e-discovery, document
Hmm.
management, the run-of-the-mill stuff, but back then was really still cutting edge.
Yeah.
And in 2006, one of the managing directors said, "Hey, I've got a project out here at Motorola.
Oh,
Would
Motorola.
love for you to come out here." Now, I was going out there to actually work on their iManage project,
Yep.
and it just so happened that somebody that was running their CLM project at the time left
Hmm.
and went to another firm. And so when I landed there, they were like, "Hey, instead of this project, you're going to do this." I'm like, "What
What's
the heck is
this?
contract management?" Like,
Yeah.
okay, I know what contracts are, but what is this as a business? So it was really trial by fire, and I spent about 3.5 years working with the team there on that, and I started realizing, okay, wow. While at that point, matter management, e-billing, they'd merged together. Everybody kind of knew what it was. Everybody had, so it had lost its real mystique at that point.
Hmm.
And this is before we got into AI and analytics stuff.
Yeah.
And so for me, contract management was like the new cool thing.
Right.
And I was like, oh, this is going to be big. And lawyers are getting more involved with this. And that conversation about, does legal own it? Does a business own it? And that
Yeah.
I came from the legal
Right.
perspective going, well, look, these are legal documents. This is really about how legal can manage this process with the compliance wrapped around it. So I just got involved with that.
Hmm.
And I went from that project to another project and started becoming kind of the contract management guy.
Yeah.
I left and went to Duff and Phelps, and we started a contract management consulting practice over there, and spent a few years and got really good involved with all the vendors.
Yeah.
And so back then it was like Upside and Mtaurus
Mm-hmm.
and all these
mTaurus.
companies that don't even exist
Yeah,
anymore.
we
Um,
ran into each other when I was at mTaurus also.
yep.
I spent some time at that tool too. And I wanted to ask you because I hear this I think of you as a legal technologist because you started your
Mhm.
career interested in technology. And I think you've probably had success because of that. You understand the pain points that a GC might deal with or that legal teams might deal with. You understand contracting. I've also experienced a similar success because I started in the legal industry as a paralegal doing
Yeah.
drafting and supporting in-house counsel with contracts. And so, um, what do you think? I mean, how do you think that's impacted your success? Just having that understanding to guide legal teams.
I think it's really if you kind of take a step back from all the hype and all the conversations around contract management and what's out there and the vendors and the tools and everything, it's really a process question. For
Yes.
the most part, 90% of this, 95% of this is all about process.
Yep.
And what ends up happening, and why I think there's a lot of disgruntled CLM customers out there, is that people are trying to treat it as a technology problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're throwing technology on top of bad process.
Right.
And what technology does is really exacerbate bad process.
Right.
Right. So
Yes.
it's sort of like, hey, here's some gasoline, go pour it on that fire and let's see what happens.
Right.
And I think coming from the legal perspective and being a lawyer, having practice and having understand the user, being in the user's shoes,
Mm-hmm.
I understand what the real pain points are. And some of those pain points are not solved by technology. Some of them are just the process. And that's one thing in legal
Yeah.
when it's just, you're talking matter management, some of these things that are wholly owned within the fence of the legal department or within a law firm. You get into contract management, now you're introducing all the non-legal entrants and users, the sales and finance and all these other folks. And so you've got cultures and process and
Yeah.
conflicts and things like that, that again, technology is not going to solve those issues.
Right.
It can enable
Right.
the making it better. And so I think, and I see this when I see people, when I see corporations implementing contract management as an IT project,
Yeah.
I see it going south more
Yeah.
often
Me too.
than when legal is driving it. Even sales, like sales will drive it some, but sales has their process. And sometimes from a legal perspective, I look at that and go, yeah, they're putting speed ramps on where maybe we need some
Yes.
speed bumps
Let's go
in place to
self-serve.
make sure.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think there's a healthy balance there, and so maybe it's a more conservative view coming from the legal side, but I think that's really kind of what drives the passion for this whole CLM thing. And again, that question of who owns it.
But I also think like as someone that's also been on the side of selling the service, right? You
Yeah,
understand the sales perspective. So that gives you a unique kind of a blend of like, how do I sell faster with this process? How do I work with my team, my legal team? And so, what's your perspective on like what our role as practitioners are? I
yeah.
think it's to marry all those different perspectives and try to find the process that works the best for everyone. What is your take on our role as practitioners and sort of helping them with that process?
Well, here's what's interesting about that, and what you said about 2 minutes ago, where you called it the legal industry. And this is something that I've struggled with over the years because sometimes I've corrected people and say, well, wait a second, legal is a profession.
Yes, that's
It's
true.
not an
That's
industry.
true.
But we've moved because of the technology enablement from it being just pure profession to the industry that we see called legal services. But
Yes.
in order to get there, we had to unbundle a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So there used to be this black box that was throw it over to legal, they'll do
Right.
something
It
magical
goes
with their
around.
law license, right? And,
Right.
and, and the stuff that we can't do out in the business. And then when you start, and again, coming from my consulting background and really sitting down with customers and saying, let's talk about the process. You talk about contract management. What does that mean? What happens to a contract before it gets to legal? And a lot of times legal departments are like, I don't know. We put templates up on a SharePoint. Some rogue salesperson goes off and copies them and does their own thing,
Right.
and we try to rein them in. And so you start getting legal to understand there's a world that's happening outside of their fence line. And when they start seeing it, they start realizing, hey, there are some things that we can enable the business to help us do, but we've got to unbundle the things that we call legal
Right.
activities. And I think we're seeing that in the industry across the board. We're seeing sort of the evolution and re-regulation of legal itself. And not to go way off on a tangent, but as the Big Four starts getting rid of their audit practices and separating those out, I think you're going to see a bigger push to this. And I think the access to justice movement has been another area where the innovation has come in, and folks have just been forced to say, okay, these 20 steps that we used to pay a lawyer to do all 20 steps, the first 8 of those can be done self-service or by a business, or they don't require a legal degree, a law license, or legal experience from a practitioner to do. And in fact, they may not even need a human to do it. We
Right.
could automate some of this stuff.
Yep.
So I think as you start unbundling, that's when you start moving into this is a legal industry and legal services industries, and firms like Elevate and the ALSP model, which is we do the business consulting, but we also do some of the legal business and legal practitioner work and consulting as well. I think all that's kind of hitting all at one
Yeah, I
time, which
agree.
is why it seems like there's this mass kind of I hate to say confusion, but just this chaos in the market right now. And maybe it's just more like hype in the market about what is contract management, who's doing what. We're moving from a profession to an industry.
Yeah.
And with that comes, the unbundling of the services, which means more consulting. And so us as practitioners come in and say, okay, we know the business side and the profession side of this.
Right.
We may not be as good at the business side of it, which we've always had bundled in the law department. In the law department, okay, for the lawyers out there, close your ears, but lawyers are generally not good business people. Unless you've got an MBA or some background running a business. What we get taught in law school is not how to run a good business.
Right.
And
It's
so
how
I
to
think what
protect the
happens
business,
is
right?
it's how to protect it,
Yeah.
but then you look at that protection and figure out how do we take some of those steps out because the lawyer doesn't need to be doing those. And then once you start unbundling and unpackaging all of that, then you start seeing the areas. But as a practitioner, like I know those pieces kind of behind the wall
Yeah.
and what the lawyers are doing that the business side may not necessarily see and understand completely. And so sometimes I just have to be a translator too,
I know,
and
for sure. It's
like a
trans
mediator.
right.
Yeah.
I've been in that role myself before. I completely understand. And I think as we're moving, I think really what it is that there's more transparency as we're trying to figure out the process. We actually have to call up people and say, what are you doing from here to here? And then
Yes.
when you have an entire enterprise organization now involved in the process, you just have to lay that out so everyone can see it. And then it's like, oh, legal isn't this black box that does this, this, and this. They're actually trying to negotiate this section of the agreement. So I think it actually gives appreciation across the enterprise when you can highlight that for a company, And, anyway.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the unbundling.
Yeah.
Like as we started unbundling for lawyers, we started realizing that, there's these 15 or 20 steps that used to just be thrown over to legal. Now we see 5 of those steps really are legal, but the rest of them are business things or finance things or sales things.
Right. And then the salesperson can go, oh, I'm really making this a lot harder than I need to, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And really both sides, there's some transparency that needed to happen from both perspectives.
I think so too. And then, I think when you're talking about sort of the next stage of the game, right? I always like to talk about, I'm a total geek for automation because of this. And so I'm like, let's get out of email. And let's let the systems and the tools that are in the world do the work for us as much as possible. And so I love to talk about sort of integrating and making that happen. And because you have that e-billing and matter management sort of background, I wanted to ask you how you see us moving towards that sort of integration for the legal department or the law department.
Yeah, and I think sometimes the desire to do the integrations and the automations sometimes is forced. Sometimes it's vendor-led forcing, like, hey, we've got all this stuff that you need to do, and sometimes you don't need to do it all. An example, I've seen how many times I've been on the consulting side where I'm helping a corporate legal department evaluate contract management systems. And they ask, well, can it also do matter management? Because we'd like one tool to do it all.
Right.
And it's sort of like that answer of, you're looking at Microsoft Word and you're like, well, can I do Excel tables in Word? Well, you can do tables, but you can't quite do all the stuff that you can do in Excel. They're both kind of fit for a purpose, but there is some overlap in it. But from a process standpoint, it may not make as much sense to say, oh, let's integrate these tools. But if we kind of step back and look at the data layer, and again, with everything being data driven these days, that's the popular view. Let's look at the data and let's understand, what is the data? What is the story telling us? Well, if I am engaging as in-house counsel, if I'm engaging outside counsel to draft or negotiate complex agreements on my behalf, and it may not be across the board, it may be unique ones. Typically, I'm going to manage that in my matter management and e-billing system, because they're billing me for some services and it's a matter and they're working on it. And then that's before the signature. And maybe something comes back into my CLM system, and now I'm managing it through the normal commercial legal CLM side. And then it gets signed and then it goes into a repository, maybe to never be seen again until we get that notice that we've been sued, or there's a dispute, right? Or there's a breach.
Or there's a pandemic, or there's something.
Or there's a pandemic and we need to dig into it. And then what happens is, okay, if it's a lawsuit or if there's some sort of dispute, well, now I'm going to engage outside counsel to help me with, figuring out, draft the memo, do the work, whatever it is. And that's going to be, again, tracked in matter management systems. And so what I say is, okay, there's a lot of information being tracked on that front end in the matter management system about the outside counsel that's doing the drafting, that's doing the negotiating. That it would be nice if we pulled some of that data into the CLM system, if only just the e-billing stuff, so I knew what my total cost of that contract really was. Right. Because if I look at my contract management system and it tells me this is our commercial terms, but I've forgotten the $50,000 I've spent on outside counsel to draft it or negotiate it, right, I'm really not getting that visibility of what that total cost of that contract was. When we're looking at the litigation side, there may be root causes, there may be issues that led to that dispute or that litigation that could be helpful to feed that information into the CLM system and feed it into the beginning of the process and create some intelligence so that when the next round of contracts are coming up, it's sort of almost steering us away from going down the same path that we already went, where we knew the contract was bad. And so there's some intelligence that can be built with that. And that's just at the data layer, not even talking about all the analytics that we have now and all the capabilities with new AI functionality where we can really ramp that up. So I think there's a really exciting play there between contract management and matter management, e-billing. I think a lot of times though it's just missed because people are just like, I just want to track contracts in a system, right, whether it's CLM or matter management. They're not thinking of the specific use cases. They're just thinking of cost savings of, I buy one system and I get really 2 for 1, right?
I agree with you. I think the conversations that I had in 2022 were, we just need to find our contracts and we need to see what's in them because of things I mentioned. I talk about a lot. It was the pandemic. It was sanctions. It was inflation step-ups now that we're dealing with, and they can't put their finger on that risk or that obligation. That was the conversation I had in 2022. As 2023 is starting, the conversation I'm having with customers that have employed or deployed CLM and now can see that repository and can mine that data is, now what do we do? What do we do with this information? And so the conversation is different in that now they can see those things that they need to track and the obligations, and they're thinking, how do I pursue this now? So the conversation is slowly getting there, I think.
It absolutely is, because before it was, I can't find it. And, it used to be, and this was almost kind of like the original conversations around matter management in the early 2000s, late 1990s, which was, man, and this was really more on the law firm side at the time when you're talking about litigation, like, I got to go through all these red welts and all these file folders to find information. Even just think of simple things like conflict checking. Like I worked for a med mal firm, and we did med mal defense, and we had expert witnesses, doctors all the time that were testifying on cases. But we had to make sure that we had a doctor that wasn't testifying contrary to our position in a different case somewhere else, right? And the data was there, but it was all in hard copy. And so matter management came in and said, hey, we digitized everything. We put it all into a database. Now, guess what? I can run a report on that doctor, and I can see all of the positions they've taken and whether they're contrary or whether there's conflicts or anything else. That's kind of where we're getting with contracts now. Contracts, I think, is a much bigger mess because contracts have never really been the focus of a good filing system.
Right.
Like even a legal filing system was much better at the time. And so now you're talking about these companies that have been around 50, 100 years. Maybe they've been around 5 years and they've gone through acquisitions, and
Mm-hmm.
there's contracts everywhere in
Everywhere.
every format. And so that's the big problem, which is where is everything?
Yeah.
And that was over the last 5 to 10 years that what we've been really focused on is let's just get a handle on those first. Let's get them all into one place,
Yeah.
and then we'll figure out what we're going to do with. Now I think we're at that next stage, which is okay, most companies are getting a good handle on all the documents.
Yeah.
Now it's let's dig
The
into the
data.
data
Yeah.
and let's figure out what the data tells us about what's in that portfolio. And some companies are seeing ticking time bombs
Yeah.
that they didn't know existed, but again, from a legal perspective, they exist whether you know it or not. Ignorance of the law is
It's
not a
not a
defense,
defense.
right?
Yes, that's true.
and
Yep.
and so it's a lot of eye opening, and sometimes business, and not to disparage the non-legal side of the business, but sometimes I do think the head in the sand technique is more of the, hey, as long as we don't know about it, it's not going to hurt
Yeah.
us, and that just doesn't play well anymore in this world of compliance and regulatory.
Yeah. I would agree with you. So if you could construct the perfect CLM to ELM or matter management system, how would it work, do you think?
Ooh, that's a loaded question. I think it's really kind of laying out the
Hmm.
process and understanding what is the process that we deal with on matter management, and how does legal engage with outside counsel, what's typically tracked in matter management, and then looking at the CLM and saying, okay, what's happening here. And what I think you'll find is that CLM is a much bigger category, because with CLM you're going to have sales, you're going to have finance, you're going to have procurement, you're going to have people involved in the process before it gets to legal. And then there's going to be sort of the legal subroutines. And maybe there's some parallel and some linear activity that's happening there. And then it's going to go outside of legal for the instance, and then legal's still kind of trailing along with it. But when you're talking about matter management e-billing, you're really talking about it starts and stops with legal.
Hmm.
And so I think the idea here is just really understanding how those two can play together, and figuring out that matter management piece can sit within that subroutine of the contract lifecycle. It doesn't have to do a lot of the front end or the back end stuff. And then just figuring out what data is relevant between the two. And I think that's what I was talking about in terms of we don't have to integrate completely. We don't have to do a lot of, back and forth of, okay, the contract document's going to go back and
Yeah.
forth between systems or anything. It's figuring out, it's really a Venn diagram.
Yes.
What does the Venn diagram look like between these two systems? What's that overlap piece? And then let's concentrate on that overlap piece in specific use case.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I would agree
yeah.
with you. And so, what can we do better as practitioners to to help our customers get there, do you think? What are some of the things we could do?
Well, I think helping, again, sort of that
Hmm.
mediation, taking the mediator's approach, which is what I like to do is when I'm talking to corporate legal departments, I like to have the business people in the
Hmm.
conversation at the same time.
Yeah.
I like to have IT in the conversation, and finance, because what you end up doing during that discovery process is you start uncovering what they know about their little world.
Yes.
And then somebody else says, "Oh, that's what happens when I send it over. Well, this is what I'm doing in my little world."
Hmm.
And then legal's going, "Oh," and you're kind of having these like moments of epiphany across the table
Yes.
where people who work together every day haven't really talked about that end-to-end life cycle. So they haven't seen what happens
Of
outside
their
of
small
their
little world.
little
Yeah. Yeah.
process. And then this kind of miracle starts to happen in a lot of
Yeah.
cases where I'm not the one giving them all the input. I'm sitting there listening to them kind of go through the ideation process of, well, what if we did this? Well, would this help? Well, why do we do it this way? And I love hearing them ask each other, why do we do it this way?
Yeah.
Because oftentimes out of that conversation comes this like awareness of, oh, we've always done it that way just because we've always done it that
Right.
way. There is no rhyme or reason. Why don't we get together and figure out a better process? And suddenly it's like now the customer is telling you what the automation and innovation should be rather than me mandating it to them. And you end up with better change
Yeah.
management when they're the finders of the
Right.
solution on their own. And sometimes it's just a matter of facilitating those
Those
conversations
conversations.
and helping them see it.
Yeah, I
So,
would agree with you. And I think that I often see when I talk to folks that have had failed implementations, it's because they didn't spend enough time in the front of the discussion of the workshops, the requirements workshops that we, sort of coined that phrase in the industry about that. Right. Instead, it's
well,
some consultant coming in and saying, or, a vendor coming in and saying, well, what do you want us to build? Instead of
yes.
having that conversation that you're talking about.
And sometimes it's not necessarily just the vendor or consultant kind of pushing an agenda. Sometimes they'll quote it out. They'll say, "Okay, this is the
Mhm.
process," and all that front end process work. It's not always easy work, and sometimes it's politically
Yeah.
charged. But sometimes you'll see the customer will look at that and go, "Okay, we only have this budget. We don't have this budget. So let's cut that stuff out and let's get right to
Yes.
the magic button with the software." And what they don't realize is, I mean, that kind of the ounce of prevention ahead of
Hmm.
time, putting in that effort at the front end is going to make a world of difference. And honestly, if you do that front end right, a lot of times it doesn't even matter what technology you pick,
Yes.
because the technology, if you look across the board, now granted there's some nuances and features and functionalities, and I even go back to even the old Selectica days, and I remember like there were some powerful features, but I remember the administrative feature was just
Yeah.
horrid. And it was because I was doing
Yeah.
implementations, and I remember going through that thing, wow, this is really hard to build a workflow in this thing. And if you build 15 steps and you miss number 13 and you've got to adjust it, you got to scrap the whole thing and start
Yes.
over.
Hmm.
So there's nuances in some of the technology that it's helpful for the customer to know, here's what it's going to take to implement this or this for these two. But when you're talking about all that process up front, 99% of that is irrelevant to the technology itself.
Yeah.
And if you focus on that, the technology piece is going to be much easier. This day and age where everybody's got these low code, clicks not code kind of
Yeah.
concepts, it's so much easier.
Yeah.
And when I work for the vendors, and on the vendor team, it's harder to have that conversation because you can't just walk in and go, well, look, a lot of the vendors are very similar across the board, because you got to figure out that differentiator to sell your
And
product.
totally.
But
Yeah. And that's a fair point.
I think that's
Yeah. I
that's what's helped me in the consulting side is, and again, going back to the very first thing I said on this call today, this industry is so small. Everybody knows everybody
right.
else. The ones who really succeed here are the straight
Hmm.
shooters, and the ones that it's kind of a no BS approach to this. And sometimes, some of what you're saying, it's sort of the Jerry Maguire effect. Like sometimes it seems like it's against your own
Yeah.
interest, but in the long run, it does pay
Well,
off.
I think if you're,
And and
go ahead.
and I was going to say, and I've got a number of clients that have been on one solution and have followed me to another solution and followed me to a third solution. And it's not so much because the solutions were just that cool. It was, they knew if I was working with it, I was going to be straight with them and I was going to tell them the good, the bad, the ugly.
Yeah.
And that's how I approach, working with folks. Because at the end of the day, I remember one of my old managing directors told me, just remember the person sitting across from you, that buyer, that legal ops person, that GC, the one that's in their day job, they're struggling just like you are to achieve what they need to do in their job.
Right.
And they're going home at night and seeing the family and they're still stressing about their day job. And if you can be a straight shooter and not set them up for failure, but set them up for success, and I'll never forget. So Shazad Bashir was the one that told me this when we were talking about how old I felt, and this was 15 years ago, right? I felt old back
In
then,
CLM years.
but I remember telling him, I said, look, I said, I just had a friend become a GC. I'm starting to feel really old. Like somebody I went to law school with is now general counsel. And he said, no, my friend. He goes, you're not going to feel old until your friends start becoming the CEO. And he said, remember how you treat them when they were AGC or legal
Yeah.
ops or GC will be how they remember you when they get that promotion and they get that next job.
Yeah.
And I've never forgotten that, because it makes me then empathize with the customers to think, okay, this legal ops manager wants to become legal ops director. If I can enable them and help them succeed in their job or even go to another company and become, a higher role, I want them to remember how I treated them and worked with them and look at me as somebody that can help facilitate success in their next
Right.
role. And that's really the key that we're all trying to get to.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I know you and I have been together on the phone in deals, and we both have a similar approach that we will respectfully push back in areas that we
Yep.
don't want to see you go down because we know where that road's going to lead, right? So
Yep.
I
Yep.
think being empathetic is really important, and I don't think we have enough of that. So kudos to
We
being
don't.
empathetic in
Yeah.
this space.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
try.
And then I guess finally, what would be, so my words of wisdom, I think echo yours to customers that are considering a purchase of CLM. And that is do the upfront work so that when you come to the table, you're ready to have the discussion to design the tool, which is the process work, and gather your stakeholders. Is there anything you have to really add to that around how folks can get ready for this journey?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it has to be just a solo. It doesn't have to be, hey, go do your homework before we show up. I think it can be collaborative. And frankly, I think sometimes people try to do too much on their own.
I've seen that.
I can always see it when I see an RFP go out or I see what vendors are selected. 9 times out of 10, I can tell you, I know somebody was told, we need a CLM, go Google search it.
Yes.
And you'll see by the list of vendors, oh, you got all the ones that paid all the high money for the SEO, and you really kind of don't know what you're doing, in evaluating that. So I think there's an element of having a consultant up front who has been through this,
Yeah.
who knows the industry, knows all the players to help you with that. But then there is some work to do on your own because an outside consultant doesn't know where all your contracts exist. They don't know, what your risk profile is yet until you've talked to them. And so I think there's a collaborative approach where if you can trust me to come in and tell you, here's the 10 things you should do to get ready for. It's a lot like what my wife does before we go on a trip with the kids. I don't have the patience for it, which is why she does it. But it's telling the kids, here are the 10 things you need to do before we head to the airport or
Right.
head on this trip. And sometimes left to their own, they'll do some of it. And sometimes it's all right, I need to come in and help you and explain, here's why we need to do this step. This isn't just me bossing you around. This isn't me just telling
Right.
you to do it for the sake of giving you directives. This is why step number 2 has to happen because step number 3 and step number 5 and step
Yes.
number 8 depend on step number 2 being right.
Yes.
And if you skip that step, these other ones are never going to be in sync
Right.
with the right
Yeah.
process. And so I think it's got to be a two-way street on that conversation, but there's a lot of work to be done before you ever think about technology. And even if I'm working with a technology, when I was at Aptus, when I was at DocuSign, I would still say the same thing on the calls, and I would tell the salespeople, close your ears because I'm about to say something that you may not like, which is you guys need to make sure to get this process stuff taken care of before you even consider putting technology on it.
Yeah. Agree. Preach.
Yeah. Can I get an amen?
Yes, you can. You can. It was so fun to talk to you today. We could talk about this for hours and hours and hours. I know, lots of good tips, and I'm excited for your next, where you're going to land because I know we're going to see each other down the road. So thank you so much for joining me today, Jason. It was really fun.
It was great to catch up with you. And by the way, I am reading the book. And so if somebody has not, this is going to be the shameless plug. Cami did not ask me to do this, but this is a great book. And it's what I love about it is it's so just straightforward. It's not like a lot of the academic books that people put out in the market. It's just literally like you sitting here talking about like what we're doing. Here's what's worked. Here's what hasn't. Yeah. It's got some good tips on some vendors in there and what to look for. So it's a great resource.
I'm glad that you feel that way. I tried to make it conversational so that anyone could just pick it up and digest it and get some value out of it. So thanks for that. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right, Jason, you take care. We'll talk soon.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Kimmy.